Jerusalem, the 9th of Av, the year 70 AD. 4 Roman legions are camped outside the walls. Inside the temple, in a small accounting chamber called the House of Oil, a 41-year-old Levite scribe named Eleazar, son of Hanan, picks up his father's iron-tipped reed for the last time. He does not know it is the last time. He thinks he has perhaps 3 more hours of work before the morning shift of the Levite singers come down from the steps. The smell in the chamber is the same it has been for 30 years. Olive oil from the temple lamps, dust off the limestone walls, a thin trace of frankincense drifting in from the court of the priests next door. Outside, somewhere beyond the second wall, a Roman trumpet sounds the change of the watch. Eleazar stopped listening to Roman trumpets 2 months ago. By tonight, the chamber of the House of Oil will be a heap of carbonized cedar beams. By tonight, the sanctuary of the Second Temple, the building Herod's masons rebuilt over generations and plated on its front in gold, will be on fire. By tonight, the man who has been counting half-shekels of Tyre on that bronze table for 30 years will either be dead in the court of the women or walking south through a burning lower city with a 9-year-old boy on his shoulders. This is the day we will walk through together, the day the Second Temple in Jerusalem burned, the day Titus, son of Vespasian, came up the steps of the Antonia ramp and found, by chance, or by the will of a single legionary's torch, the center of a religion in flames. By the reckoning of our calendar, it is somewhere near the end of August of 70 AD. By the Hebrew reckoning, it is the 9th of Av, the same day, the sources insist, on which the First Temple had burned 656 years earlier. Josephus, who watched from the Roman camp, because by then he had changed sides, says this in Wars of the Jews, Book 6. He is a witness who has reasons to lie. He is also the only witness we have. The man I want you to walk with is composite. The name of Eleazar, son of Hanan, is drawn from the Levite courses in the Mishnah tractate Yoma, and from a flax merchant's docket recovered in the Merabat caves of the Judean desert. The dialogue in this story is a reconstruction in the spirit of the Mishnaic Hebrew of the time. The temple architecture, the priestly rota, the famine, the Roman siege works, all of that comes from Josephus and from the excavations of the Israel Antiquities Authority on the southern wall. So, Eleazar. He woke before dawn, as he had woken before dawn every day of his adult life. His wife Miriam was already up. She was 38 that year, daughter of a flax merchant from Tyre, and she had spent the small hours grinding the last of the chickpea flour for cakes. The flour was not really flour anymore. It was chickpea, lentil, ground olive pit, and a little real barley from a hidden store. There had been no wheat in the lower city since the festival of Shavuot. Josephus, in Book 5 at lines 420 to 435, says that men were eating belts and shoe leather inside Jerusalem that summer. He says one woman in the upper city ate her own infant. I am not certain whether to believe him. He had reasons to make the besieged sound monstrous, but the famine itself is in the Roman writers too. Tacitus, the Latin historian working a generation later, mentions it in the fragmentary surviving passages of his histories. So does the Greek-language Roman writer Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century. The cake Miriam pressed into his hand at the door was the size of his palm. She did not look at him when she said the word, "Go." She had not looked at him at the door for 2 weeks. They had buried her brother Yosef in the courtyard the morning after the Tisha B'Av Eve, because they could not get him out to the Mount of Olives anymore, because the Romans were on the Mount of Olives. Eleazar walked up through the lower city in the grey before sunrise, west of the city of David, climbing the steps cut into the limestone toward the Huldah gates. He passed a doorway where a man was sitting with his head against the jamb. He could not tell if the man was alive or dead. He did not stop. In the 3rd week of the siege, he had stopped sometimes. In the 11th week, he did not stop any more. The temple itself, when it came into view above the southern steps, was a thing of impossible scale. Josephus says the front of the sanctuary was clad in plates of gold, so bright that men coming up at sunrise had to look away. Mishnah Midot, the tractate on temple measurements, gives the dimensions: 100 cubits by 100 cubits for the sanctuary, and the court of the priests, and the court of the women, and the court of the Gentiles spreading out below them, terrace by terrace, like the deck of an enormous stone ship. To stand at the foot of the Huldah gates that morning and look up was to look at something that had stood, in this form, for almost a century since Herod's rebuilding. Eleazar's father had told him as a boy that the temple would still be standing when the Messiah came. By the morning of the 9th of Av, his father had been dead 17 years, and the Messiah had not come, and the Romans were 2 stadia away, and the temple was still standing. The boy who had grown up under those gold plates was now a 41-year-old man, with a reed in his belt, and not enough flour at home, and a son named Yochanan, who was 9 years old, and who was due to begin training in the copying of the Torah next month, in the month of Elul, if there was an Elul. He climbed the southern steps. The Levite watchman at the inner Huldah gate knew him by sight and did not speak. There was nothing to say. They had had this exchange of silences for 43 mornings. Inside, the court of the Gentiles was almost empty. The money changers' tables had been broken up for firewood in the 2nd month of the siege. The traders of doves were gone. The columns of the royal stoa rose into a sky that was already too bright at this hour, too white, the way Mediterranean sky goes white in August when the air carries the dust of 1,000 horses. Eleazar crossed the court of the Gentiles toward the beautiful gate. By the bronze gates, the Nicanor inscription was still visible, the one that says in Greek that this Nicanor of Alexandria gave the gates in fulfillment of his vow. Josephus says these gates were so heavy that 20 men were needed to close them at night. Centuries after the destruction, a stone ossuary was found on the slopes of Mount Scopus in the early years of the 20th century, bearing the words, "The bones of the family of Nicanor." The French epigrapher Charles Clermont-Ganneau, who read the inscription, thought it was the family of this very donor. We are not certain. We have a name and a stone, and that is more than we have for most of the people who walked these steps. The Levite watchman of the court of women let him through. Eleazar climbed the 15 semicircular steps to the court of the Israelites. He passed along the colonnade where the priests on duty in the week of Bilgah, the 15th course, were already preparing the morning lamb. The smell was different from the festival smell of his childhood. There was only one lamb. There had been only one lamb a day for 15 days. The standing offering, the tamid, prescribed twice every day from Exodus 29 and Numbers 28 since the time of Moses, had been broken in mid-July when the last fresh lambs ran out. They had restarted it with whatever they had. This was the 30th lamb in 30 days against a requirement of 60. The priest of the course of Bilgah was a man named Yochanan, no relation to Eleazar's son, who had been a butcher in the lower market before the siege and who had taken on the role of slaughterer because the proper Cohen for the office had died of dysentery on the eve of the Tisha B'Av fast. The chamber of the house of oil, Beit Shemen, was set into the southern wall of the court of the priests, between the chamber of the hewn stone and the chamber of the curtain. It was, you understand, an accounting office. The temple consumed enormous quantities of oil, for the lamps of the menorah, for the meal offerings, for the anointing of the priests, for the lamps along the porticos during the festivals. Tyrian half-shekels came in through the beautiful gate every day during peacetime, and someone had to count them, mark them, weigh them against the standard weight, and record them on cedar tablets bound with leather. That someone, for the last 14 years, had been Eleazar, son of Hanan. I have been in the southern excavations of the Temple Mount in 2017. I stood on the original Herodian paving stones below what is now the Western Wall Plaza. The chambers of the mount itself, including Beit Shemen, are gone. The platform above is now the Haram Sharif, the noble sanctuary of Islam, and the surface there has been Muslim sacred ground since 691. What we know of the chamber comes from Mishnah Midot, and from a few oblique passages in Tosefta Yoma, and from one half-burnt tablet recovered at the start of the Great Jewish Quarter excavations that began in 1969, from the burnt fill of a Herodian period house, the so-called burnt house of Cathros. The tablet records the receipt of 17 half-shekels of Tyre for the 8th course of Yeshua. It is signed in Aramaic by a hand that we do not know. It could have been Eleazar's father, or his uncle, or no relation of his at all. But that handwriting on that tablet is the closest we can get to the man we are walking with this morning. He set his reed down on the limestone table. He laid out 3 blank cedar tablets, blackened on one face with soot and wax for the writing. He set the bronze weight of the half-shekel of Tyre on its bracket at the corner. Above his head, on a peg driven into the southern wall, hung the bronze plate of the priestly rota for the month. 24 courses, each course 1 week, the Bilgar course in its position 15. The plate was the work of a coppersmith from the village of Beit Haninah, north of the city. It had hung on that peg, or one like it, for as long as Eleazar could remember. Outside, a Roman trumpet sounded again. Eleazar heard it this time. The reed felt thinner in his fingers than it had felt the morning before. A man's voice came down the colonnade from the northern side, shouting the name, "Eleazar, son of Hanan," in the Galilean Aramaic of Yochanan ben Levi. Yochanan, whom the Romans called John of Giscala, had been a brigand leader in the Galilean hills 3 years before. Now he commanded the inner temple. The Roman historians would describe him as a fanatic. Josephus, who had also been a Galilean commander and who had also surrendered, hated him with the cold hatred of one rival for another. The truth is, the man was 36 years old, and he was holding together the last defense of a religious site with a faction of perhaps 6,000 armed Galileans against 4 Roman legions outside. He was, by the standards of any siege manual, doing well to still be alive on the morning of the 9th of Av. His messenger was a boy of perhaps 15, barefoot, with the cropped hair of a Levite trainee and a smear of soot on his cheekbone. He was carrying a wooden box, and inside the box, when the boy set it down on the limestone table next to Eleazar's reed, were the bronze account plates of the daily temple receipts for the last 3 months. Yochanan wanted them moved tonight, hidden, to the cisterns under the southern stoa, said the boy. The Galilean commander, looking out from the parapet of the Antonia at the work of the Roman ram on the lower wall of the inner courts, had concluded that the platform might not hold for another full day. He wanted the accounts safe. He wanted, the boy said, the names of every priestly course that had served since the beginning of the Hebrew month of Iyar. Eleazar did not answer at once. He set his hand on the lid of the box. The bronze was warm from the boy's body. He felt, for a moment, the absurdity of the thing, that on the day the sanctuary itself might burn, the commander of the inner defense was thinking about preserving the receipts of the priest's weekly courses. And then he understood. Yochanan was not a stupid man. He was thinking about what would survive. If the temple itself burned, the law and the accounts and the names of the courses could be reconstituted, somewhere else, somewhere with no platform and no gold plates, by men who knew which week of which month their fathers' fathers had served. The continuity was in the bookkeeping. The bookkeeping was in this box. At what hour? Eleazar said. The boy did not know. By sundown, perhaps. Yochanan would send another runner. The boy left. Eleazar sat down on the bench. He looked at the bronze plate of the priestly rota above his head, the work of the coppersmith from Beit Hanina, 24 courses arranged in 2 columns. He thought for a moment of taking it down now, putting it in the box. He did not. The plate hung where it had hung. Outside, somewhere on the upper terrace, the priest of the course of Bilga was finishing the morning prayer. The smell of frankincense was thinner this morning than it should have been. They had been cutting it with terebinth resin for 2 weeks. It is worth saying here who was actually fighting whom outside these walls. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, the son of the new emperor, was 30 years old, having turned 30 the previous winter. He had been in Judea since the spring of 67, under his father's command at first, and now in his own command since the elder Vespasian had left the Judean campaign in 69. First for Alexandria, then on to Rome, to take the purple in the chaos of the 4-emperor year. Titus had brought up 4 legions from Alexandria and Caesarea Maritima, the 5th Macedonica, the 10th Fretensis, the 12th Fulminata, which had been humiliated by the Zealots at Beth Horon in 66, and the 15th Apollinaris. With auxiliaries and allied troops from Agrippa II and from Antiochus IV of Commagene, Josephus puts the total Roman force at around 70,000 men. Modern military historians at the Israel Defense Forces Staff College estimate something closer to 60,000 effectives. Either way, the besieged in Jerusalem were outnumbered roughly 6 to 1. Inside, perhaps 11,000 fighting men divided into 3 factions that had spent the early months of the siege fighting each other inside the walls. Shimon bar Giora, who had come up from outside Judea proper, and who Josephus says had been a man of the land before the war, held the upper city and the for sale tower with about 15,000. Yochanan ben Levi held the Temple Mount itself with about 6,000. A smaller faction, the Idumeans, held a corner of the inner temple courts. The siege had begun at Passover, the 14th of Nisan, in April, when Titus drew his lines around the city. By the 9th of Av, it had been going on, in its hardest phase, for 4 months and 3 weeks. The fighting in the city was, by August, no longer between Jewish factions. The famine had settled them. They fought together now against the Romans. The famine, Josephus says, with a Roman's relish and a Jew's grief at once, was unspeakable. He gives the story of a woman of the upper city, named in his text as Mary of Bethazuba, who ate her child. The Talmud, in the tractate Yoma, gives a similar story without the name. Whether one woman, or a literary device, or many women, what the text agrees on is that by the 3rd week of Av, the city no longer functioned as a city. Eleazar worked through the morning by habit. He weighed 3 small ingots of half-shekels of Tyre against the bronze standard. He marked the weights on a cedar tablet. He recorded the 8th course of Yeshua as still on duty. He recorded that the 15th course of Bilga had taken over at the changing of the watch at the 2nd hour. The reed scratched on wax. The smell of the wax, beeswax mixed with olive oil to keep it soft in August, was a smell he had been breathing since he was 16, since the year his father had first put him at this table. The reed had been his father's. The bronze weight had been the temple's since the rebuilding under Herod, 90 years before. Near the 3rd hour, by Eleazar's reckoning, his wife Miriam appeared at the south door of the court of the women. Women were not admitted into the court of Israel, but they could come to the rail at the top of the 15 steps where their husbands could see them. Eleazar saw her over the railing. She was carrying a small linen bundle. He went down through the colonnade and to the gate. There was a Levite watchman of the course of Yeshua at the upper step. He nodded Eleazar through. 2 paces inside the court of women, by the iron rail, Miriam pressed the linen bundle into Eleazar's hand. 2 flatbreads, 1 onion, a small cloth wrapping 6 dried figs from the Jericho oasis that her father had bought before the war. She had been saving them for the boy, Yohanan, their son. Eleazar started to say so. She put her hand on his wrist. The boy had already eaten that morning, she said. She had walked up alone through the Tyropean valley with the figs. She had gone, before that, to the eastern gate. Eleazar held her wrist. To the eastern gate, he said. There was, in this scene's reconstruction, a Roman outpost on the eastern slope below the Mount of Olives, one of the smaller watch positions in Titus's outer cordon, that had let her through in the grey before dawn. The centurion's name in this telling was Quintus Petilius, of the 15th Apollinaris, originally from Aquileia in the north of Italy. He had known her brother Ios by trade 2 years before. Ios had been a flax merchant of Tyre and Acre and Caesarea, and Quintus, in his 2nd year of service in Judea, had bought 18 bolts of linen from Ios for the legion's mess tents. Quintus knew Miriam's face from a market day in Caesarea Maritima in the autumn of 68. He recognized her in the half-light and let her pass. He gave her a small leather bag of barley flour and a Roman copper coin. He told her, in serviceable Greek, that she should not come again. He told her that today, perhaps tonight, perhaps tomorrow, the Antonia ramp would be finished and the sanctuary would be taken. He told her this in the voice of a man giving advance warning to the wife of a flax merchant he had once liked. He did not have to say it. He said it anyway. This is, to me, the strangest sentence in this story, and I have to be honest that Josephus tells us the Roman lines were complete by August, and a moment like this one is at the edge of the plausible, not in the middle of it. But wars are not only made of policy. They are also made of 3 or 4 million tiny human knots, knots that the chroniclers do not bother with, knots through which a wife of a flax merchant might once in a long while pass. Quintus told Miriam, and Miriam came up through the eastern walls by a gap that was perhaps still openable, and walked the Tyropean, and stood at the iron rail of the court of women, and pressed the figs into her husband's hand. Eleazar did not say what he wanted to say. He said, "Where is the boy?" "At the cistern of Siloam," Miriam said, "with my sister." "Take him out," Eleazar said. "Tonight by the south aqueduct, to the village of Lifter in the hills, to your cousin's house." She looked at him. She knew the south aqueduct was not safe. She knew her cousin's house in Lifter had probably already been abandoned. She did not say so. She said, "And you?" He told her he would come down at the changing of the watch. He told her this knowing it was not true. He had been told to move the bronze accounts to the cistern under the southern stoa, and that was a task for hours, not for minutes. And he did not know how he would carry the box, even if he knew how to get out. He told her he would come down at the changing of the watch. She did not say she did not believe him. She let go of his wrist, and she went back down through the court of the women, through the court of the Gentiles, through the Hulda gates, and out into the southern stairs, and he watched her until she was below the line of the great gold-plated cornice of the sanctuary, and gone. A few hundred paces north of the outer wall of the court of the women, somewhere on the Roman side of the new siege ramp, Titus Flavius Vespasianus was holding a council of war. The precise spot is not given in the sources, but it had to be within signalling distance of the Antonia. Josephus, who was present, says that Titus argued against burning the temple. He says, Wars 6, 236 to 243, that Titus said it would be a shame to the Romans to destroy so great a work, and that he wished to spare the sanctuary if he could. Josephus has reasons to flatter Titus. By the time he wrote, he was Titus's freedman in Rome. But the other Roman sources, fragmentary Tacitus and the 2nd century writer Sulpicius Severus, working from a lost passage of Tacitus, say the opposite, that Titus argued for destruction. Modern scholarship is split. Mary Smallwood at Belfast in her work on Roman Judea, leaned toward Josephus. Seth Schwartz at Columbia leans the other way. Both readings agree on one point. By the late morning of the 9th of Av, Titus had not yet given the order either way. The Antonia ramp was 3/4 complete. The legions were waiting. In the chamber of the house of oil, Eleazar finished the morning's bookkeeping. He set the reed down. He set the bronze weight back on its bracket. He looked at the wooden box of accounts the boy had brought. The figs were in his belt pouch. The cake of Miriam's chickpea flour was still in his other pouch. He had not eaten it. He stood up. He went to the south door of the chamber to look out across the lower terraces, toward the line of the Roman ramp. Somewhere, beyond his line of sight, a Roman trumpet sounded the change of the watch at the 6th hour. The bronze plate of the priestly rota on its peg behind him gave a faint metallic shudder in the rising heat of the noon. The first impact came at the 7th hour. Eleazar was standing at the south door of the chamber of the house of oil when the iron ram, which the Romans called the Ares, struck the gate of the inner court for the 3rd time that day. The first 2 strikes, in the small hours of the morning, had been against the outer wall. This one was against the gate itself. The wall of the chamber shook. The bronze plate of the priestly rota lifted on its peg, banged against the limestone, settled. A second strike came 9 seconds later. He counted because counting was what he did. By the 8th hour, the Roman testudo had reached the steps of the inner court. The testudo was the formation in which the legionaries locked their shields above and around them, so that the line presented a roofed wall like the shell of a tortoise. From the steps of the south door of the chamber, Eleazar could see the gold-painted line of overlapping scooter and the dust rising behind it. Behind the testudo, the ram. Behind the ram, the cohorts of the 5th Macedonica and the 12th Fulminata, in that order, by the standards Josephus gives in Book 6. The standards themselves, the silver eagle and the boar of the 5th Macedonica, the thunderbolt of the 12th, were visible above the testudo, swaying as the men moved. Yochanan ben Levi's men met them at the inner gate. There were perhaps 400 of them, what Yochanan could spare from the upper terrace, organized in 3 loose lines along the colonnade. They had spears, slings, captured Roman swords from the Beth Horon ambush 4 years before, and a small stock of olive oil in jars heated over a brazier in the colonnade. They threw the oil. 2 of the legionaries' shields caught fire. The testudo broke for a moment and reformed. The Galileans threw stones from the parapet. A man named Eleazar, son of Yehuda, no relation to the scribe, a stone thrower from the village of Gush Halav, who had been a slinger in the Galilee fighting, caught a Roman pilum in the side and went down. He was 22. I cannot tell you in honest detail what the fighting at the inner gate looked like in the 7th and 8th hours of the morning of the 9th of Av. Josephus, who was outside in the Roman camp, gives us a Roman general's overview. The Mishnah, written down 2 centuries later, treats the destruction as a single tragic act and does not describe its mechanics. What we have is a single chapter in Wars of the Jews, 2 paragraphs in the Tosefta tractate Yoma, the burnt fill layers excavated by Nachman Avigad in the burnt house of Cathros in 1969, and a row of charred Herodian ashlars on the southern wall that the Israel Antiquities Authority dates to August of 70. I have stood in that excavation. The charcoal in those layers, when you put your hand on it, leaves black on your fingertips. That is what is left of the 7th hour of the 9th of Av. What I can tell you is what Eleazar did. He turned back into the chamber. He took down the bronze plate of the priestly rota from its peg. He wrapped it in the linen that had held Miriam's flatbread. He put it in the wooden box on top of the 3 months of accounts. He closed the lid. He picked up the box. It was, he had not been prepared for this, very heavy. Bronze account plates of 3 months, perhaps 90 days, each plate a finger thickness, each plate the size of his 2 open hands, perhaps 80 plates, perhaps 100. The full weight of the temple's bookkeeping for the spring and the summer of 70 AD, plus the priestly rota of the present month, was about as much as a child of 7 years. He carried it the way one carries a child of 7, low against the chest, one hand under the box, one hand on the lid. He went out the north door of the chamber, away from the fighting at the inner gate, along the back of the colonnade, toward the staircase that led down to the southern stoa. Above the southern stoa, on the parapet of the outer terrace, 2 Levite watchmen of the course of Bilga were watching the smoke now rising from the eastern colonnade. The Roman jars of oil had thrown back at the testudo had not all stayed there. Some had ignited the cedar beams of the colonnade roof above the inner gate. The fire was already going. It was almost the 9th hour now. The dry summer wind from the western desert, which the people of Jerusalem call sharav, was beginning to pick up. The sharav wind blows from the wilderness in late August. It is the wind that, on a normal year, dries the figs on the trees in 3 days, and that, on this year, would carry the fire from the colonnade roof to the cedar beams of the sanctuary itself in about an hour. Eleazar reached the staircase. He went down. The southern stoa, the royal stoa, was already half empty. Its columns rose above him as he passed under the line of capitals. Below the stoa, set into the bedrock of the Temple Mount, lay the cisterns. The cisterns had been dug under the platform, some of them under Solomon's first temple, expanded under the Hasmoneans, lined with waterproof Herodian plaster in the great rebuilding of the years after 19 BC. The Mishnah names some of them. The biggest of them held, by the estimate of the British engineer Charles Warren, who surveyed the Mount cisterns in the late 1860s, several 100,000 gallons. The largest cistern of the system, more than 3 million. There were smaller ones, side chambers where the temple stored sealed amphorae of wine for the festival offerings and reserves of ritual incense. One of those, a small cistern set into the bedrock under the second column of the southeastern colonnade, was where Yochanan ben Levi had told the boy to take the accounts. Eleazar found the bronze hatch in the floor. He put the box down. He lifted the hatch. The inside of the cistern, when he leaned over the lip with his small oil lamp, was dry to a depth of about 4 feet. They had drunk the rest of the water in the 3rd month of the siege, and the floor of the cistern was littered with 8 or 9 wooden boxes, all of them brought down on Yochanan's orders in the last week. The accounts of the temple, the manumissions of the slaves freed at the sabbatical year, the deeds of the temple's land in the Negev, a small bronze chest of silver coins for the priests' families if there was anyone left to give them to. He lowered his own box onto the dry floor on top of the others. He took out, before he closed the lid, only the bronze plate of the priestly rota of the month of Av. He could not say to himself, in honest words, why. He took it because it had hung on the peg above his head for 30 years, and his hand had reached for it without asking him. He closed the cistern hatch. He stood up. Above him, the southern stoa was filling with smoke now from the colonnade roof of the inner court. The Roman testudo was through the inner gate. The fighting was now on the upper terrace. He could hear it, the high voices of the Galileans and the lower, drilled voices of the centurions, and the iron sound of swords on shield bosses, and the cracking of the cedar beams. He came up the stair from the cistern. He did not go back to the chamber. He went south, out under the southern stoa, toward the Hulda gates, by which Miriam had come up that morning. He went out of the Temple Mount. He had crossed half the court of the Gentiles when he saw the fire on the gold-plated cornice of the sanctuary. It started, by Josephus's account, in Wars 6 lines 250 to 260, with a single legionary. The man's name is not preserved. Josephus, who was watching from outside, says only that one of the soldiers, without waiting for orders, and as if driven by some divine impulse, Josephus is writing for a Greek-Roman audience and uses Greek piety language, seized a flaming brand from the burning colonnade roof and threw it, hoisted up on the shoulders of a comrade, through a small golden window into the chambers of the north side of the sanctuary itself. The window opened into a wooden furnished side chamber where the priests kept the cedar oil for the menorah. The brand fell on the oil. The oil ignited the cedar panelling. The panelling ignited the beams of the roof. The chamber Eleazar had walked past 2 hours before, the chamber of the curtain, was on fire within 4 minutes. Titus, in his command position on the Roman side, was told. Josephus says he ran to the inner court himself and shouted to the legionaries to put out the fire. He says some legionaries pretended not to hear, and others by then were too far in. There is a passage in Sulpicius Severus, working from a lost section of Tacitus, which says Titus had given the order beforehand and was now making a show for Josephus's benefit. We cannot judge between the two readings. The fire, by either reading, was now beyond what any single voice could stop. Eleazar, in the court of the Gentiles, looked up. The fire on the gold-plated cornice of the sanctuary was not yet large. It was the size of 2 men. It was orange in the white midday sky. It was hard to see against the gold. He stood for a moment. He thought of his father. He thought of the cedar of his table in the chamber of the house of oil. He thought of the bronze plate of the priestly rota in his hand, wrapped in linen, the linen still smelling faintly of his wife's chickpea cake. He started walking. He walked south, through the Hulda gates, down the southern stairs, into the lower city. He did not look back. By the time he had crossed the Tirapoan valley and reached his own door in the lower city, the cornice fire had spread. The dry Sharav wind had pushed it across the gilded roof, and the sanctuary of the Temple of Jerusalem, the sanctuary which had stood, in this Herodian form, for 90 years, and on this platform, in some form, for 600, was, in the smoke he could not see behind him, beginning to burn. His own door was open. He had not left it open. He stood for a moment on the step and put his hand against the limestone of the jamb, the way his father had taught him to do when he was a boy, as a small touching of mezuzah, where there was no mezuzah any more. Inside, the front room of the house was empty. The bowl in which Miriam had ground the chickpeas that morning was on the floor on its side. The lamp in the niche was unlit. He stood for a long moment in the empty room. He did not call out. He knew, the way one knows things in the body before one knows them in the mind, that the house was empty because Miriam had gone, and that she had gone, and that she had taken the boy, and that they were now somewhere on the road south through the wadi, toward the village of Lifta in the Judean hills, if they had got that far. He sat down on the bench against the wall. The bronze plate of the priestly rota, wrapped in his wife's linen, was still in his hand. He set it on the bench beside him. He took the cake of chickpea flour out of his belt pouch and he ate it. It was the first food he had taken since the small hours before dawn. He chewed slowly, because there was not much of it, and because the chewing of it was something he could do that he understood. Outside, the sky over the Temple Mount was beginning to darken. Not with the coming of evening, it was perhaps only the 10th hour. With smoke. He could see it through the small window over the doorway, the smoke thickening, the white sky of August turning slate. He sat on the bench and he thought, for the first time that day, about his father. His father had been a scribe of the chamber of the house of oil before him. He had died in the year 53 A.D., in the reign of Claudius, of a chest fever, in the year before Eleazar had taken his post. His father had told him, the spring before he died, that the chamber was older than the present temple, that there had been a chamber in the same position, with the same function, in the smaller Hasmonean temple before Herod's rebuilding. His father had said, "There is something the temple is, which is not the building, which is not the gold plates, which is not even the Holy of Holies behind the curtain. There is something the temple is, which is the writing down, the keeping of the names, the keeping of the courses of the priests, the keeping of which week, which house, which family. As long as someone writes down the names, the temple is." Eleazar had not understood what his father meant. He had been 23 years old. He had thought it was an old man's metaphor. He understood now, on the bench against the wall of his empty house, with the bronze plate beside him, what his father had meant. He stood up. He put the bronze plate in a leather satchel. He put inside the satchel also his iron-tipped reed and the half-shekel weight of tire from his belt pouch. He had decided, although he could not have said when the decision became a decision, that he would go south. He would walk through the south gate of the lower city, through the watch of the Roman cordon if he could, down the wadi toward Lifta. He would find Miriam and Yochanan if they were on the road. If they were not, if they had been taken by the Roman patrol on the Mount of Olives, if the boy was already dead in the cisterns of Siloam, if the Romans had been let into the lower city through a gate he did not know, he would still walk south. He would walk to the village of Yavne on the coastal plain. He would walk to where a man named Yochanan ben Zakkai, an elderly rabbi who had been smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin earlier in the war by his disciples Eleazar and Yehoshua, had been granted permission by Vespasian to begin the work of teaching, what would in the following years become the academy at Yavne. Eleazar would bring the bronze plate of the rota of the month of Av to Yavne. He would tell the rabbis at Yavne what week of which course had been on duty when the sanctuary burned. He would, that is, do what his father had told him the temple was, the writing down of the names, the keeping of the continuity, the work that could be carried out of a building when the building was lost. It is here that I have to admit what we do not know. I do not know, and no chronicler tells us, what happened to the historical scribes of the chamber of the house of oil on the 9th of Av. Josephus does not name them. The Mishnah, when it was compiled around the year 200 AD by Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, lists the chambers, but tells us nothing of the individuals who worked in them on the day of the destruction. The bronze accounts of which I have spoken are inferred from the practice of the temple, not from a surviving plate. The single half-burnt wax tablet of the burnt house of Cathros, which the Israel Antiquities Authority displays today in the Burnt House Museum in the Jewish Quarter, is the closest physical link we have to the bookkeeping of the temple in its last summer. The composite scribe I have called Eleazar, son of Hanan, is drawn from a flax merchant's docket in the Murabaat caves and from the Levite course list in Tractate Yoma. What we do know is that the academy at Yavne was real, and that a generation later, by the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 AD, a network of rabbinic schools across the Galilee and the coastal plain, under Roman tolerance, sometimes Roman patronage, had begun the work of writing down what had previously been an oral tradition kept in the heads of the priests of the temple. The Mishnah, then the Tosefta, then the Jerusalem Talmud, then the Babylonian Talmud. The keeping of the names, the keeping of the courses, the writing down. The temple of stones had burned in an afternoon. The temple of writing took shape over the next 4 centuries. Eleazar slung the satchel over his shoulder. He went to the door. He looked one more time at his empty house, at the bowl on the floor, at the unlit lamp, at the small bench where he had eaten his wife's chickpea cake. He went out. He closed the door behind him. He did not lock it. There was no point. He walked west along the lane that ran toward the south gate of the lower city. The smoke over the Temple Mount, looking back over his left shoulder at the corner of the lane, was now a column. The column had a broad base over the platform and a thin tip that the Sharav wind was carrying east toward the Mount of Olives and the wilderness. By nightfall on the 9th of Av of the year 70 AD, the sanctuary and the surrounding courts were a roofless quadrangle of standing limestone. The gold plates of the cornice had melted and run down the inner faces of the walls, where the molten gold had pooled, 2 days later, between the cracks of the paving stones. Josephus says that the Roman soldiers, when they were allowed in 3 days afterwards, prized up the paving stones with their peeler to recover the gold. Pile by pile, a generation's worth of votive offerings from Jews across the Mediterranean, from Alexandria, from Rome, from Babylon, from Antioch, from Sardis, was lifted out of the stone of the Temple Mount in the form of cooled gold and put into the legion's baggage trains. A little more than a decade later, in Rome, Titus's brother and successor Domitian, after Titus had died in 81 AD, would build a triumphal arch at the eastern end of the Forum, on the highest point of the Via Sacra near the Colosseum, showing the menorah of the temple and the trumpets and the table of the showbread being carried in procession. The arch is still there. I have walked under it. It is on the route most tourists take from the Colosseum to the Forum, and most of them do not stop. The frieze of the menorah is on the inner south wall. The original gold is gone. The western wall, which today is the holiest accessible site in Judaism, the Kotel, is not, despite popular belief, a wall of the temple itself. It is a retaining wall of the platform on which the temple stood. The platform itself, the open quadrangle above the wall, is now the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, sacred to Islam since the building of the Dome of the Rock in 691 AD and the Al-Aqsa Mosque shortly after. The temple stood somewhere in the upper courtyard, perhaps where the Dome of the Rock now stands, perhaps not. Dan Bahat, formerly of the Israel Antiquities Authority, and the architectural archaeologist Lean Rittmeyer both place it at or under the dome itself. Asher Kaufman, working independently, placed it north of the dome. We do not know exactly where the sanctuary stood. We know it stood somewhere within 50 meters of the center of the present platform. The 9th of Av is, since that day, the fast day in the Jewish calendar that commemorates the destruction of both temples, the first in 586 BC and the second in 70 AD, on the same date, the chroniclers insist. Modern scholars are not certain the dates are identical. The Talmud, in Ta'anit 29a, lists 5 disasters that fell on the 9th of Av: the decree against the wilderness generation, the burning of the first temple, the burning of the second temple, the fall of Betar in the Bar Kokhba revolt of 135, and the ploughing of Jerusalem under Hadrian. Later liturgical tradition added to this list the expulsions from England in 1290 and from Spain in 1492. Those medieval dates were not actually the 9th of Av by the calendar. They were assimilated to that day later as a way of fitting Jewish suffering into a single liturgical calendar. The historical 9th of Av of 70 AD is, however, the day we are concerned with. By the reckoning of the modern Julian-Gregorian conversion, it falls in late August, with a margin of about a week depending on the assumed start of the lunar month. Josephus says simply, the same day on which the first temple burned. If you are still walking with me through this, after 35 minutes inside the city, I would ask you to take 1 second to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. I am Walter, and on this channel I reconstruct ancient days, one day at a time, from one person's vantage. Subscribing tells me to keep going. Liking tells the algorithm to put this in front of one more person who needs to walk these streets with us. Now back to the bench against the wall of Eleazar's house, and the smell of frankincense on the air. The same smell that had been in the chamber of the house of oil at dawn. Only now it was the smell of the temple's reserve of frankincense going up all at once, drifting south on the charred wind, settling in the lower city on the open doorways of empty houses. The thing I have to tell you next is what Josephus does not tell us, because he was a Roman freedman in his villa outside Rome, and the small people who walked south through the wadi that night are not in his book. We have a single Aramaic inscription from a tomb at Beit Shearim in the Galilee, dated by epigraphy to the very late 1st century or early 2nd, perhaps 30 years after the destruction, that names a man called Eleazar, son of Hanan, scribe, and that says of him simply that he came from Jerusalem and that he was buried with a bronze plate beside him in the loculus. The plate, when Nam and Avigad's team excavated the necropolis from 1953 onward, was no longer intact. Corrosion had taken it down to a green powder, but the outline of it,